what are some of the challenges that you've experienced or run into during your time in regulatory and dealing with, labeling and advertising?
Um, Having people talk to each other too late in the process is probably one of the
Mm,
biggest issues because I think there's a misunderstanding about the impact messaging may have, well, specifically for regulatory, but I think it carries over to other functional areas as well. But for example, understanding the message can affect your regulatory strategy. And a lot of it crosses over into, and I know a little bit about your process. I haven't worked through it. I haven't had that pleasure, but understanding your customer, understanding your product, understanding how you fit into the bigger picture, all of that is important for your message, but it's also really important for your regulatory strategy and for your design for that matter. I mean, it's kind of elementary to having a successful product.
Hi, and welcome to Message Engineer. We are here today with Marianne Jacklyn, who is the CEO of Traxn Consulting, Traxn. I am so excited to have you here today. We have had the chance to work together in a couple of companies in the past. I know you've been at Guidant, Biotronic. We worked together at Hardport. And now you have your own consulting firm, which is tremendous. So welcome to the Message Engineer today.
Well, thanks for having me. As you've said, it's we've known each other for a long time, so I'm very excited to be your first podcast guest.
All right. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Waiting for the sun to come up. Had my
It's a
coffee,
bit early.
had some breakfast. I'm ready to go.
All right. Fantastic. So a couple of questions about kind of medtech. I mean, how did you find medtech? How did you get into medical devices?
Well, I kind of fell into it. Um, I studied physical sciences in school, so math, chemistry, and physics in university, and then I moved back home and wanted to find a job. So I can't say it was very directed or intentional. I was looking for work, and the first job I had was a quality assurance investigator at U.S. Surgical. And so from there, I learned on the job through quality systems, starting with complaint investigations, which was an interesting way to start actually to see how things go wrong. And then into internal auditing, and from there into regulatory affairs. And my first job in regulatory was actually focused on labeling and advertising. And then I moved into submissions. So, labeling, advertising, which of course grew a lot into other media over the years, has always been kind of special to me. I love doing marketing stuff, as you know. Um, but yeah, that's my favorite part of regulatory, actually. So.
That's great. That's great. And we'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay,
Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. I understand not quality systems anymore.
right. I'm
So
trying
tell
to
us a
move
little bit about
away. Exactly. So I started consulting just a couple of years ago, and being new to the idea, you know, took on everything that I thought I could do. Um, and quality systems, I'm moving away from. I can do it. I'm not. Um, it doesn't excite me as much as the pre-market regulatory work does. So I prefer helping companies with strategy for new products, getting new products on the market in the US or Europe. Uh, and I forgot your question. Gonna rely on
That's what
editing.
editing is for. And my question is, like, what are you doing now with Traxn?
Okay.
What are you focusing on now?
Um, so I've helped companies with all different types of submissions from pre-subs to 510Ks and PMA devices. I'll be working on a de novo pretty soon. So primarily FDA focused with pre-market submission work.
Great, great, great. All right, so now we'll jump a bit more into messaging specifically. So you said that you started in complaints, and that was a great kind of grounding, and moved into auditing, and then into labeling and advertising.
Mhm.
And so, messaging is a big part of labeling and advertising. And so when you hear the word kind of messaging, what does that kind of evoke for you or make you think of?
Oh, that's a great question. It's kind of laying the foundation for all of your communications with all of your stakeholders. You need to be consistent across the board, but you also need to tailor things to your audience. And I mean, messaging in my mind, messaging is also what we do with regulatory agencies, right? We need to be consistent, know our product, know different parts of the business. Um, in marketing and sales, you need to talk about those things with your customers. In regulatory, we need to talk about those things with our customers, which are the regulatory authorities. And so, having a solid foundation that's understood across the company for all the players, but is also able to be tailored to the right audience of who's going to hear it is really, really important.
Great. That's great. Consistency, tailoring, and you mentioned kind of across the company,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
So, with in trying to ensure consistency and making sure the message is tailored to the right kind of target group, and ensuring that that is kind of carried across the company. What are some of the challenges that you've experienced or run into during your time in regulatory and dealing with, labeling and advertising?
Um, Having people talk to each other too late in the process is probably one of the
Mm,
biggest issues because I think there's a misunderstanding about the impact messaging may have, well, specifically for regulatory, but I think it carries over to other functional areas as well. But for example, understanding the message can affect your regulatory strategy. And a lot of it crosses over into, and I know a little bit about your process. I haven't worked through it. I haven't had that pleasure, but understanding your customer, understanding your product, understanding how you fit into the bigger picture, all of that is important for your message, but it's also really important for your regulatory strategy and for your design for that matter. I mean, it's kind of elementary to having a successful product.
Can you expand a little bit more on why messaging or
Mhm.
how messaging is integral and critical to kind of regulatory strategy and to design?
Sure. So messaging often involves claims. So you want to make sure that you're collecting the right data to support the message you want to say and to make sure you can. make the claim you want to claim. Um, Even something as simple as the description of the device in a regulatory submission can help you later with the way you want to position it and the way you want to talk about it in the market. Um, Design as well, you can have a really, really cool product that no one wants or needs. And so understanding who your customer is, understanding user needs, I mean, that's supposed to be one of the first things you do in a design control process, right? Is understand user needs and customer requirements. So I think there's a tendency, unfortunately, to look at those things as check boxes or just paperwork, but there's a lot of value in going through that process, and taking it really seriously and really thinking about what are the requirements? What problem are we trying to solve? Who are we talking to? Who are we fixing the problem for? And how are we going to tell them about it? That all goes hand in hand with how you design the product, what's in the labeling, and then what your messaging is, what your future messaging and promotional activities are going to be. But you really need to have a very deep understanding of your product and your market first, and build on that in order to create a message. It's all very integral to the rest of it, to the way you design your preclinical or clinical study, for example, or your bench testing. And maybe you don't need to do this endpoint or collect this data for your regulatory submission, but if you just add one more piece onto a study that you're already doing, you can have a much stronger message later. Things like that are can make a huge difference in how successful and how consistent things are across a company.
Great. Yeah, great points. I mean, it it makes me think of this, the idea that of start with the end in mind,
Hmm.
right? So know at the beginning where you're headed.
Right.
And I think a lot of times in startups, there's that kind of time, money pressure to kind of hurry up at the beginning. But sometimes that can really catch you on the back on the back end,
Yes,
particularly in the revenue stream,
absolutely.
the revenue forecast.
Hmm.
So yeah, great points, and really critical to pull those things out up front, like very clear user needs and
Right.
just translate to design requirements, right? And
Exactly.
regulatory submissions and clinical studies. So very cross-functional, right? Messaging is very cross-functional. Um, a lot of people think about it belonging to marketing.
Right.
that's that's not the way it works.
Mm-mm.
Best practices. So just kind of like switch, the flip side of that. What
Right.
are some of the best practices you've seen in your experience in companies or in your consulting business as relates to kind of doing messaging in the best possible way, and particularly cross functionally, because you've brought that up a few times.
Right. I mean, that's key. Cross-functional communication. Um, I know people tend to hate meetings, but I found the most success has been when you have a cross-functional team of people that are dedicated to the messaging and on later through execution of the message into promotional materials and promotional review. So I think it works best when everyone understands the context of what you're talking about. So, what doesn't work is if a product manager comes to me in regulatory and says, "Here's a brochure. We need it now. We have to get it printed." Right? That does not work very well. What does work is um, having an ongoing conversation on a regular basis where there's an understanding of, here's our overall message structure. Here are the key messages for this group. We want to make sure they understand this about the product, whether that's like, I don't know, payers. And for the administrative staff, they need to know this, and for the surgeon, they need to know this. Um, and understanding what about the product or service is important to which stakeholder or customer whom you're going to talk to, and then having the context of that when you're rolling things out. So if everyone's already on board with the plan, the execution is pretty smooth, and that works best. Again, I know people are averse to more meetings, but I think meetings are the best way to do that, to have like a regular, depending on the cadence, weekly, biweekly meeting where you can discuss things. It's also the easiest way to edit because you can understand why, I added designed to into your claim, or why legal wanted you to phrase it a certain way. And then you can work together to come up with the strongest language that is supportable and defensible.
Yeah, great points. I certainly started when I first started out in marketing, it was very much that it was paper and we would send it off. We learned who had the most edits first and it would go to that person. Let's say in one company, it was legal. So it went to legal. This individual, she would mark it up. And then we'll go to the next individual who didn't necessarily agree with those markups, but had some more. And then by the time it came back to me, I was like, this doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And then I'd have to go do the tour to talk to people about how and why and explain and have those individual negotiations one by one. And that takes a lot of time.
Yes,
Uh,
it does. It does take a lot of time. And it helps to have, I typically think of marketing, legal, regulatory, maybe clinical, but R&D is also a really important component in the cross-functional mix, depending on when you're talking about it. But um, the engineers need to know who they're designing for. As we said, it's also integrated. It's really hard to separate one group out or one part of it out. I've actually seen
they
design
all play a
changes made.
role.
Sorry,
Mm.
I've actually seen, design changes made after marketing communications meetings because the engineer learned something about who they were trying to satisfy, or, learned a new user need that hadn't been captured earlier, things like that. So the more communication cross-functionally you can have, the earlier in the process, there's really very little downside to that. Um, as you said, there's a perception that speed is more important than everything. But I think you need to look at time to market and time on a grander scale, not just the next step. You need to look at the end, like you said. What's the
A
actual
little bit of
goal
the
we're trying
tortoise
to
and the
reach?
hare. Mm. Great points. Very critical. I've definitely seen too where product development has data and information that may not have been kind of communicated more broadly
Mhm.
that supports certain aspects and claims that hadn't been considered as well. And so, uh, I found, including all those individuals tend to
Yep.
save you a lot of time in the long run.
Yes.
So great. Yeah, great point. All very critical people to have involved. So that's a great kind of best practice then to have these kind of regular cross-functional meetings with a set group of individuals who are responsible for kind of understanding the communications and what needs to be said and how and why.
Right.
And the overall plan, as you said before, right? Like, what's the point? Where are we headed?
Yeah.
What's the context? And it can help everyone get on the same page and collaborate,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Collaboration.
Imagine that.
And
It's
we're
a
all
big
in the,
thing.
presumably everyone has the same goal. That's That's usually how it works, right? And a reminder of that also helps, like to back way up sometimes and say, what are we trying to accomplish here? Can kind of reset everyone on the team to
Mm.
the reminder of what we're actually trying to do.
Goals.
Goals.
I like that. That's great. Back way up and remind people like why we're at this together, because sometimes there are these kind of I've seen these kind of artificial walls spring up.
Yes.
Uh, and you get your, I should say, stereotypical, uh, what's the right word? Kind of stereotypical assumptions
Yes. Mhm.
about what's happening that are not conducive to the end result,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah, I've been
There's-
called sales prevention enough times in my career that that's the stereotype to overcome for sure. And that's yeah,
yeah, I hear you.
yeah.
I
So
hear you. You're here to help.
yep, here to help. Here to help. There's
All
a
right.
different risk tolerance, of course. I think that's true.
Mm,
Like people who have a lower
sure.
who are more risk averse are more likely to end up in regulatory than if you're more risk tolerant, you're probably more likely to be in sales than in regulatory or in marketing than in regulatory. But
Mhm.
that's why you need different people on your team to balance each other out. And I think having that foundation of a common goal and understanding that everyone's trying to do the best toward that goal and a mutual respect for what everyone brings to the table. I mean, this goes beyond messaging, this goes across the board, right? But it absolutely applies to messaging and creating the best product, whether the product's the message or the device or the technology.
Yeah, I've to your point about kind of sales prevention and yeah, it has to be
Yeah,
about the same goal. It has to be we're after the same thing. It's to hopefully, the goal is to in some way, shape, or form improve patient outcome,
yep,
right?
yep,
You know, so prevent disease, improve outcome of certain treatments, uh, so on and so forth. So tackle chronic diseases. And I think sometimes we forget.
right.
It's an important what you bring up is an important reminder
Hmm.
to maybe when it's devolving a bit to take a breath, back up and okay, why are we here? Let's remember for a minute. So
Exactly,
great point. It's
exactly.
a great point. Help people to kind of cross functionally get on the same page, develop that level of respect and balance. That is critical, right?
Yes.
You bring up balance, and that idea of checks and balances is critical.
Hmm.
You know, I don't, as a long time marketing person, I understand that sometimes there are things that I'd like to say that may end up in a bit of hot water, put people in. That's not the goal. That's
Nope.
not how we It's not how we help patients. That is not how we grow a company and a culture. And
Right.
so that's not to say I haven't been frustrated
Of course.
sometimes,
Of course.
but I think that's a natural part of the process, right?
Hmm.
We working together, we all come up with a better solution.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah. So I read some research years ago in the Harvard Business Review about how teams who are more alike tend to come to a decision faster, but it is less, uh, what's right? How did they phrase it? It's not as a good, it's not the best decision. So
Hmm.
less diverse teams come to decisions faster, but the outcomes are not as good as diverse teams
Right.
who take a bit longer. right? There's these checks and balances, and there's debate and conversation, but they come out with better decisions that kind of stand the test of time. So
Right.
that's
Right.
yeah, a super critical point. All right. So we talked about, are there any unique challenges, kind of just diving a little bit deeper on the into the messaging,
Mhm.
startups? Are there any unique considerations that you've seen around messaging for startups that we should be thinking about?
That's a good question. I think recognizing what you're up against and,
Mm,
um, if you're playing with the big boys, or the well-established, incumbents, right? Is that the word you use? Incumbents, like, that are well-established, have tons of resources at their disposal, have, an established presence in the market. You need to use different ways to get your message across because you don't have the same tools. It doesn't mean you can't compete. It means you need to compete in a way that leverages your strengths, which can often be, um, responsiveness, being nimble, um, agile, but that only works well if you're working together. Again, I mean, I have to come back to that, but again, if everyone's on the same page and understands the context, you can respond that much faster too to a changing situation, and you can respond faster than the big competitors you might be up against. Um, the other thing with startups is often there's a lack of experience, and I think it's another part of the diversity balance that's important is that it's really great to have fresh eyes on things, and that's part of the creativity. And it's important to balance that with people with experience who can talk about pitfalls or minefields or things to avoid. Um, and so that's another consideration. Um, I'm trying to think if that's all I can
Are
think of
there
at the moment.
are there any unique messaging considerations for startups versus, if you're at one of these kind of billion-dollar incumbents?
Mhm. Messaging. I think you might have less time, so your message needs to be striking and attention grabbing, right away because you don't have the brand recognition yet, right? So, um, you need to get people's attention, and, that's funny to hear coming from a regulatory person, but you need to stand out somehow. And I think that is a really important part of creating the messaging framework and what you're trying to do. Um, the other thing is I think the risk profile or the risk environment changes with the growth of the company as well, where in some ways the large companies can afford to take more risk because they have the resources to deal with things if it goes wrong. Um, and that's definitely part of the consideration when you're thinking about how much risk you can take. Um, on the other hand, when you're not on anyone's radar yet, you might have be able to tolerate a little more risk. So it depends on where your audience is, who's paying attention, and I think a recognition that those things are dynamic. And so that's also going back to the communication with startups in particular, things can change really fast in the way you are positioned in the market and where you are in your growth trajectory. And so, along with that growth, your risk tolerance is going to change. And so something that may have been okay to say at the initial launch may not be okay to say a year into it, or vice versa. And so it's another part of understanding the big picture and the different points of view of the people on your team. I'm sorry, I feel like a broken record here with this cross-functional communication. I'm a big fan of cross-functional communication.
You're not a broken record. I think that it's too easy for departments to get in silos, and I think when we're, in particular, these last few years, and being very more dispersed and more remote, I think that depending upon how things are pursued within the company or culturally, or set up culturally within the company, people can start focusing in their silos, and I think that becomes very detrimental to
Mhm, mhm.
the ongoing success of the company, and as you keep pointing out, the goals, right?
Right.
And it's a lot easier to talk amongst your kind of brethren, right, and complain and squawk
Yep,
than it is to like go reach out across the aisle and have a real conversation and try to figure it out,
yep.
right? That takes some guts and some humility, and
That's
not the
true.
easiest thing always to do.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, smaller the company is, more critical that is.
Yes.
And I love the idea you brought up of this dynamic nature
Mhm.
of messaging and how things can shift,
Yeah.
right? Because not only within the company, right? We think about things like, oh, we might get a new indication, or we might have some new data, or we may open a new geography, right?
Right.
Uh, but more broadly, I think that also happens when you think about laws. People often think about laws as these immutable rules, but there's a reason why there are courts and judges and multiple levels of appeal, and
Exactly.
they're not immutable, and they change, and the interpretation of them change. And so I've also experienced that, where people come and say, well, we did say that this is all right, but it appears that's now being interpreted in a different way by XYZ external, agency. And therefore, we need to kind of rethink this a little bit.
Yep.
So, um, yeah, that's really critical to kind of have that ongoing conversation about what is and isn't okay, and yeah,
Exactly.
work
'Cause
through
there's
that
always
together
I
as a
mean,
group.
there's always new information, coming in, from all different parts of the company, internal, external, different agencies,
Hmm.
warning letters, court cases, whatever,
Fun things
that
like
you can
that.
learn from,
Mhm.
and also there's it used to be called, CGMP, Current Good Manufacturing Practices, but the reason the current was in there was exactly that, because what's currently considered best practice? What's the current interpretation? What's the
Mhm.
it goes to the same thing. It's a dynamic environment, and that needs to be recognized and be ready to change.
Mhm.
The only
Yeah,
constant.
so working cross-functionally. What's that?
Change is the only constant, right?
There is no doubt about that. And I think that all that information coming in, right? It doesn't People talk about, well, it's information, but it's data, but it's not knowledge yet, right? And I think, you bring that up, that the cross-functional group and the dynamic nature of the agencies and the environment in which we work, it becomes critical to hear those interpretations from multiple individuals in multiple
Right,
fields, so that we can collaborate on kind of the best outcome,
right, right.
the best output. as relates to messaging. So, last three questions. If you're giving some advice to someone today who was looking to get into medical device, medtech, digital health, regulatory, what would you tell them?
Oh, the community is very helpful and willing to teach new people. That's something, a lesson I keep learning over and over. But um, people are very generous with their time and knowledge if you're respectful of their time and knowledge. And if you're trying to learn something new, in regulatory in particular, there's RAPS, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, and their educational resources are really good. They can be expensive if it's new for you and if your company isn't supporting it. Um, but it's something that I think is a really great investment if you make an investment of your time to use all of the resources it offers. Um, I think getting into regulatory is a lot more creative than people may think. There's a lot of room for creativity because things are changing, because it's dynamic, because there's interpretation, um, especially with digital health, things are changing so fast. And the regulatory framework is trying to recognize how fast things can change. And I think FDA is trying really hard and being relatively successful for an agency to recognize how dynamic it is and work with the industry to support that type of development and make those products available on the market. Those are the first things I'd
That's
say.
great. Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. That's great advice. I love the idea of the ability to be creative within regulatory, which is not uh, eh, it's not exactly an adjective, not a word. It's not creativity is not a word often associated with regulatory.
Mm-mm.
So I love that idea that there is still a lot of opportunity for creativity in the regulatory space, and the advice to look to RAPS is the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society is a really terrific resource
Mhm.
for information and knowledge and networking.
Right.
That was the first thing you said. That's a brilliant comment.
Networking is key.
Relationships are everything.
LinkedIn as well. I started following
Mhm.
people I didn't know on LinkedIn who posted really good content. Um, and I learn a lot that way. And then, you can, as I said, people in my experience, people are very generous, as long as you're respectful of their time. Um, people A lot of people who are in med tech are really in it because they want to make a difference for patients. And however far removed, filling out a checklist or something may feel, that's still at the heart of a lot of people who are in this business. And so I find people are very willing to help one another to reach those broader goals.
That's great. Great advice. Great advice. So I'm going to flip it over. And what advice would you give to someone wanting to get into kind of med tech, med device, digital health, telehealth marketing
Hmm.
from your perspective?
From my perspective, um, getting into it, I would say marketing is done well. Marketing is should be driving the business. And so if you're getting into it, you need to understand the business and you need to
Mm.
learn all aspects of the business and become um, broadly aware. So you need to understand things from, yes, of course, your customer is probably the most thing. Understand your customer, understand the market. But then internally, to be successful within your company, you need to understand why regulatory needs to know something early, or um, why it takes logistics this much time to get the product out the door, or just have some kind of level of understanding of how different parts of the organization work, because you're going to need all of them to help you be successful.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with that. Those are great points. Great points. Make sure you understand kind of the why behind the different departments,
Mhm.
but make sure to start with the customer and the
Yep.
market and understand that best. So that's great advice for marketing. So last question, said there were three. How do people find you if they want to talk to you?
Ah, best way is to find me on LinkedIn, um, Marianne Jacklyn. And you can have all my contact information there. You can reach me at mjacklyn at traxnconsulting.com. And again, Traxn is Traxn. And that's the best way to find me.
Fantastic. Well, it has been a pleasure and a joy speaking with you today. Thank you so much for taking time out to have this conversation, and love all your commentary about cross-functional and the customer, and how we need to keep reaching back for that common goal to orient everyone to work together in a dynamic environment and move forward. So thank you again today. And we hope to have you again on
Thank
The
you.
Message Engineer.
Thank
All
you. It's
right.
been a
Bye
pleasure.
for now.
Bye.
Yep. Bye bye.